At dawn on the 5th of November, 1956, 6,000 British and French paratroopers dropped onto the beaches around Port Said, at the northern mouth of the Suez Canal. Within a day, the town had fallen, and by the following morning, British commanders believed the canal itself could be secured within 24 hours. It was, by every conventional military measure, working. But 3,000 miles away, in a set of offices near the Bank of England, a different kind of siege was already underway. Since Nasser had nationalized the canal in July, the pound sterling had been under sustained speculative attack, and the bank had spent weeks quietly selling dollars out of its reserves to hold the currency at its fixed value. On the 6th of November, the day British paratroopers reached the canal, the Chancellor of the Exchequer received a set of figures that had nothing to do with tanks or aircraft. The reserves were falling faster than anyone outside a small circle in London and Washington had been told. Somewhere between breakfast and the cabinet meeting that followed, Prime Minister Anthony Eden gave the order to stop. Not because the operation had failed, because Britain could no longer afford to finish it. The empire that had bankrolled half the world for a century did not run out of soldiers at Suez, it ran out of dollars. And the country that decided exactly when Britain would run out of dollars was not Egypt. To understand how a currency crisis in London ended an invasion in Egypt, you have to go back 4 months, to a canal company boardroom in Cairo, and to a decision Nasser made in July that nobody in Washington had seen coming either. The Suez Canal had belonged, on paper, to the Suez Canal Company, a private concern registered in Egypt but controlled almost entirely by British and French shareholders since the 1870s, when a near-bankrupt Egyptian ruler had sold his shares to the British government at Disraeli's urging. For 80 years it had been the shortest maritime route between Europe and Asia, the artery through which most of Britain's oil arrived from the Persian Gulf. In July 1956, the United States and Britain withdrew an offer to help finance Egypt's Aswan Dam, partly in response to Gamal Abdel Nasser's arms deals with the Soviet bloc and his recognition of Communist China. Nasser's answer came 6 days later. On the 26th of July, in a speech in Alexandria, he announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company, using the code word for the canal's original chief engineer as his cabinet's signal to seize the offices. Every foreign asset of the company was to become Egyptian state property. Eden, who had spent the 1930s watching Neville Chamberlain accommodate Mussolini and Hitler, told his cabinet that Nasser could not be permitted to have, in his words, a thumb on Britain's windpipe. He was not speaking loosely. Roughly 2/3 of Western Europe's oil moved through the canal, and a substantial share of it was Britain's. The withdrawal of Western financing for the Aswan Dam was itself a calculated financial move, not a simple loss of interest. Washington and London had offered roughly $70 million toward the dam's first stage in December 1955, hoping to keep Nasser aligned with the West against Soviet influence in the region. Nasser had accepted the terms, but through 1956, as Egypt continued buying Czechoslovak and Soviet arms and extended diplomatic recognition to Communist China, Dulles concluded that funding the dam would be funding a government Washington no longer trusted, and Congress had grown openly hostile to the idea in hearings that summer. Dulles withdrew the offer on the 19th of July, citing Egypt's economy as too fragile to support the loan, an explanation Nasser and most historians since have read as a face-saving cover for a political decision. Nasser needed a new source of revenue for the dam within days, and the canal company, still generating some £39 million a year in tolls of which Egypt itself received under $1 million, was sitting in plain view. The nationalization was not an act of ideological defiance for its own sake. It was, on Nasser's own telling and in the assessment of the American officials who had engineered the funding withdrawal, a financing decision made in direct response to another financing decision. The canal crisis had a canal at its center and a balance sheet underneath it from the very first week. What followed over the next 3 months was a diplomatic performance staged for an American audience that had already made its position clear. The Eisenhower administration proposed a Suez Canal Users Association, an 18-nation body meant to operate the canal jointly with Egypt. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles shuttled through a sequence of conferences designed, in part, simply to run out the diplomatic clock until after the American presidential election in November. Eisenhower had told his aides directly that he did not believe force could be justified over Nasser's action, and that using it would hand the Soviet Union a propaganda gift in the developing world it could not have manufactured on its own. Britain and France drew the opposite conclusion from the same set of facts. In August, British and French military staffs began drawing up an invasion plan. By October, with the diplomatic track exhausted, and Israel's own conflict with Egypt escalating along the Sinai border, the three governments moved into secrecy. On the 22nd of October, at a villa in the Paris suburb of Sèvres, representatives of Britain, France, and Israel signed a document that has since become known as the Protocol of Sèvres. Israel would invade the Sinai Peninsula, and Britain and France would then present an ultimatum to both combatants demanding withdrawal from the canal zone, intervening themselves under the pretext of separating the two sides and protecting international shipping. It was, on its face, a rescue mission. It was, underneath, a prearranged pretext for repossessing the canal by force. Israeli forces crossed into the Sinai on the 29th of October. Britain and France issued their ultimatum the next day, and when it was, as planned, rejected, British bombers struck Egyptian airfields on the 31st. Paratroopers landed at Port Said on the 5th of November. The three governments at Sèvres were not acting from a single shared motive, even though they signed the same document. French Prime Minister Guy Mollet believed, with justification, that Nasser was arming and financing the Algerian independence movement, then fighting French rule, and saw the canal operation as a way to weaken Egypt's capacity to support that war directly. Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion wanted the Straits of Tiran opened to Israeli shipping and the Sinai cleared of the guerrilla units then operating against southern Israel, and needed British and French air cover to make an attack on a much larger neighbor survivable. Eden's motive was the most personal of the three. A prime minister, not yet 2 years into the job, chronically ill since a 1953 gallbladder operation that had gone wrong and left him dependent on amphetamines to function through long days, staking his premiership on proving he could be as decisive against an Arab nationalist as Churchill, his predecessor, and longtime rival, had been against Hitler. 3 separate calculations, one signed protocol, and not one of the 3 men fully understood, in October 1956, that the operation's actual limiting factor would turn out to be a currency peg none of them had mentioned at Sèvres at all. There is a version of this story in which Suez was simply the last gasp of 19th-century gunboat diplomacy, an old empire trying and failing to hold a canal by force in an age that had moved past it. That version is not wrong. Eden genuinely believed he was confronting a dictator on the model of the 1930s, and the collusion with Israel and France was real, secret, and morally indefensible, even by the standards Britain claimed to be defending. But that account describes only the military and diplomatic surface of the crisis. It leaves out the fact that the operation's ending was decided, almost to the day, by a set of numbers being tracked in an office at the Bank of England, numbers that had very little to do with Egyptian resistance and everything to do with how many dollars Britain had left, and who controlled the conditions under which it could get more. Here is the part of the story that most accounts of Suez leave out entirely, or mention only in passing on the way to the ceasefire. The mechanism has 3 moving parts, and each is worth taking separately, because together they explain why a canal dispute in Egypt could be decided by a filing cabinet in Washington. The first part is the fixed exchange rate itself. Under the Bretton Woods arrangement Britain had signed in 1944, sterling was pegged to the dollar at $2.80, with a narrow band either side, inside which the Bank of England was obliged to intervene, buying or selling its own currency to hold the line. Defending that peg cost real reserves, dollar for dollar, every time the market tested it. The second part is the sterling area itself. Roughly 50 countries and territories, from Australia to the Gulf states to large parts of West Africa, held their own reserves in sterling rather than gold or dollars, and settled a large share of their trade in it, on the understanding that the Bank of England would always convert sterling to dollars on demand at the fixed rate. This was, in effect, a private banking system built on top of the British Empire's old trading relationships, and it made the pound function as genuine international money. But it also meant that a loss of confidence in sterling was never a purely British problem. It threatened to become 50 countries' problem simultaneously, all at once, which is precisely the argument Macmillan would make to Washington in November. The third part is the one that gave the United States its leverage. America, and only America, had accumulated dollar reserves and gold holdings large enough, by 1956, to credibly step in and either support sterling or, just as easily, tip it over. Britain could ask the IMF for a drawing, but the IMF's own resources depended heavily on American subscriptions, and the fund's incoming managing director in 1956 was, by convention, effectively vetted by Washington. Britain could ask for a bilateral American loan, but only the U.S. Treasury could approve one. And Britain could not stop the U.S. Treasury from selling the American government's own holdings of British sterling bonds onto the open market, a sale that would function exactly like a fresh wave of speculative selling, except originating from the one government whose selling could not be absorbed or waited out. Put the three parts together and the picture is complete. Britain had built the most successful reserve currency in the world, discovered that the country able to overrule its use in a crisis was no longer itself, and then triggered exactly the kind of crisis in which that difference would matter. Since the end of the Second World War, the pound sterling had operated inside the Bretton Woods system at a fixed rate of $2.80, defended by the Bank of England's gold and dollar reserves. Britain's own treasury had set an informal floor. Reserves were not supposed to fall below $2,000 million, a level below which financial markets would read the position as a signal that devaluation, or a currency float, was imminent. Sterling was not simply Britain's domestic currency. It was still, in 1956, held as a reserve currency across roughly a quarter of the world's population, in the sterling area that ran from the Caribbean to Malaya, and it functioned as a form of international money in a way the French franc or the Egyptian pound never had. That status was Britain's inheritance from a century of financial primacy. It was also, as 1956 would demonstrate, a liability, because a currency that the whole world holds is a currency the whole world can also sell. The reserve losses began almost the moment Nasser nationalized the canal, months before a single British soldier landed. Confidence in sterling had already been fragile through 1955 and the first half of 1956. The nationalization, the diplomatic crisis, and the growing likelihood of military action turned a slow leak into a controlled bleed. In October 1956, the Bank of England lost $84 million defending the pound. That was before the invasion had even begun. Chancellor of the Exchequer Harold Macmillan and the Governor of the Bank of England, Cameron Cobold, spent the autumn projecting calm in public, while privately watching the floor approach. Macmillan had gone to Washington in September, ostensibly for the annual meetings of the IMF and World Bank governors, and had used the trip to meet privately with U.S. Treasury Secretary George Humphrey, with Dulles, and with Eisenhower himself, hoping to establish in advance that American financial support would be available if sterling came under strain. Humphrey made no commitment. Macmillan chose to interpret the conversation as an assurance regardless, a piece of wishful diplomacy that would matter enormously in November. On the 22nd of November 1956, with the invasion already launched and the reserves already falling sharply, Macmillan sent a telegram directly to Humphrey. The document survives in Britain's National Archives. In it, Macmillan reminded Humphrey that the Treasury received Britain's weekly reserve figures and would already have seen the trend worsening since the intervention in Egypt began. He described Britain's position as, in his words, the major banker for the world, and asked, in substance, for American support to defend it. The choice of phrase was not accidental. Macmillan was reminding Washington that a collapse in sterling would not stay confined to Britain. It would ripple through every economy that held sterling balances as reserves, across the entire sterling area. It was an argument about systemic risk, made from the weaker side of the negotiation. The American response was to do almost nothing, deliberately, for 2 more weeks. Britain requested emergency financial assistance and access to the International Monetary Fund. Humphrey, at the September meetings, had already expressed doubts that the IMF should extend a large-scale drawing to any single country, worried that American taxpayers would effectively be lending the dollars and that other nations would demand the same treatment. Britain also asked for emergency oil, since the canal's closure and the sabotage of pipelines running through Syria had cut off a large share of Western Europe's supply. The United States, which controlled the tankers and refineries capable of covering the shortfall, declined to release them. And separately from the IMF question, the U.S. Treasury held a substantial quantity of British government sterling bonds, acquired through wartime and post-war financial arrangements, and it let it be known, through channels that reached London clearly enough, that it was prepared to sell them. A large sale of American-held sterling bonds onto the market, at the exact moment traders were already testing the pound's defenses, would have done to sterling deliberately what the market was already threatening to do by accident: break the $2.80 peg and force a devaluation Britain had spent a decade trying to avoid. Nothing here required a shot to be fired. It required a telephone call, or the credible threat of one. By early December, the mechanics of the position were plain to everyone involved, even if they were not being said aloud in public. Macmillan would have to stand up in the House of Commons on the 4th of December and admit that November's reserve losses alone had come to $279 million, pushing the total position toward the 2,000 million floor Britain had sworn to itself it would not cross. Without external support, the choice would no longer be Britain's to make. The pound would have to float, or be devalued outright. In the middle of a crisis, Eden had launched, to demonstrate that Britain could still act as a great power without asking anyone's permission. The irony was almost too neat to write. The operation meant to prove imperial independence was about to be ended by imperial dependence on a currency arrangement Britain no longer fully controlled. The resolution came on the 3rd of December, in Washington, in a meeting between Humphrey and British officials that even the British side did not expect to succeed. Humphrey opened by repeating his objections. The U.S. Treasury would have to borrow the dollars itself, which risked pushing up interest rates in the New York money market, and a drawing of this size would violate the IMF's own lending conventions and invite every other member state to ask for the same treatment. Then, according to the British ambassador's own account of the meeting, Humphrey abruptly reversed himself. He proposed that Britain draw not a partial tranche, but the full amount available to it, $561 million immediately, plus a standby arrangement for a further $739 million, a combined package of $1.3 billion, the entire 100% of Britain's IMF quota, 4 times larger than any drawing the fund had ever approved. The condition attached to the reversal was never written into any formal document, because it did not need to be. Britain had already, by the time the meeting took place, accepted the second half of the United Nations ceasefire resolution and set the 22nd of December as the deadline for full troop withdrawal from Egypt. The money followed the ceasefire. It did not cause it in a single legal instrument anyone could point to, but no British official who lived through that autumn ever seriously doubted which came first in Washington's calculation. None of this required President Eisenhower to give a single public order. It required a Treasury Secretary willing to let a wealthy ally's central bank run down its reserves for 6 weeks without help, an American government willing to sit on IMF and export-import bank machinery that only Washington could unlock, and the understanding, shared by everyone in the room, that a modern reserve currency is not defended by armies. It is defended by whoever is willing to buy it when everyone else is selling. And in November 1956, the only institution with dollars enough to do that at scale was the United States government, and it had decided, coldly and without a shot fired, not to. It is worth pausing on a rival explanation, because it is the one most popular accounts of Suez actually lead with. On the 5th of November, Soviet Premier Nikolai Bulganin sent messages to London, Paris, and Tel Aviv, warning of rocket attacks on Western Europe and hinting at direct Soviet intervention. Issued the same week, Soviet tanks were crushing the Hungarian uprising in Budapest. That threat is real. It is documented, and generations of textbooks have treated it as the reason Eden folded. It is not wrong to mention it, but the timeline does not support it as the decisive factor. Britain's own military and intelligence establishment assessed the Soviet threat as almost certainly a bluff. Moscow had neither the transport aircraft nor the credible intention to strike Western Europe over a colonial dispute in Egypt, and British planners said so at the time. The reserve figures, by contrast, were not a bluff. They were being recalculated daily by the Bank of England. They were falling in a pattern the Treasury could project forward to the exact week the 2,000 million floor would be breached, and Eden's own chancellor was telling him so directly. The Soviet letter added drama and cover. It let Eden frame the retreat as a response to nuclear brinkmanship, rather than to a balance sheet, which was a considerably more palatable story to tell the British public and his own backbenchers. But the decision to halt was made and communicated to the cabinet on the morning of the 6th, and the reserve crisis had already been building for 6 weeks by then, tracked in cables between London and Washington that never mention Bulganin at all. The rocket threat is the version of this story that lets everyone leave with their dignity intact. The reserve figures are the version that is actually in the files. The consequence stacking, once London accepted that the money would not come without a ceasefire, moved fast. Eden ordered the halt on the 6th of November. At the moment, his own commanders believed the canal could be fully secured within a day. The ceasefire took effect at midnight. The reserves kept falling through the rest of November regardless, because confidence does not repair itself the instant a political decision is announced. Egypt, having lost the military engagement on the ground, won the war for the canal anyway. 40 ships had been sunk in the channel by retreating Egyptian forces, blocking it to all shipping for months, and the canal did not reopen to full traffic until the following spring. British and French troops completed their withdrawal by the 22nd of December, precisely on the deadline Washington had, in effect, set. The United Nations Emergency Force, the first peacekeeping operation of its kind, moved in behind them. Israel, which had achieved most of its military objectives in the Sinai, held out under separate American and Soviet pressure until March 1957 before completing its own withdrawal. The human cost, before any of that, was Egyptian. A British government white paper released that December, compiled by the president of the Law Society, gave what it called a reasonable estimate of 2,750 Egyptian casualties at Port Said alone, including roughly 650 dead, a large share of them civilians caught in a dense port city during 10 days of urban combat and bombing. Later historians have put total Egyptian dead across the whole crisis as high as 3,000. British losses were, by comparison, small: 16 dead against 10 French and around 230 Israeli soldiers killed in the separate Sinai campaign. The canal that all of this was fought over did not reopen to shipping until the following April, after a months-long United Nations salvage operation to raise the 40 ships Egypt had scuttled in its own channel rather than let Britain and France profit from an intact prize. At home, the cost arrived in specific, dated forms rather than abstractions. Petrol rationing was reintroduced in Britain in December 1956 for the first time since the Second World War, a direct consequence of the canal closure and the sabotaged pipelines, and it stayed in place until May 1957. Unemployment in export-dependent industries ticked upward through the winter as the currency instability rattled business confidence. And in January 1957, Anthony Eden resigned as Prime Minister, citing his health. He had suffered from chronic bile duct problems since a botched 1953 operation, and colleagues later said the strain of the autumn had visibly broken him. He was succeeded by Harold Macmillan, the same chancellor who had spent November on the telephone to Washington trying to keep the reserves above the floor. It is worth sitting with that succession for a moment. The politician who inherited the premiership from the Suez debacle was not a critic of the operation. He was its financial negotiator, promoted into the job partly because he had been in the room when Britain learned exactly how the new order worked. Here is what happened to the people who made the decisions, because it is the part of this story almost never told alongside the rest of it. Anthony Eden left office with a full ministerial pension, and in 1961 was created Earl of Avon, entering the House of Lords with a hereditary peerage that remains in his family today. He was never investigated, censured by any binding body, or stripped of honors for authorizing a secret war planned in collusion with a foreign government and concealed from his own cabinet colleagues and from Parliament. He lived for another 21 years. Selwyn Lloyd, his foreign secretary and the British signatory at Sèvres, went on to serve as Chancellor of the Exchequer within 4 years of the crisis, and later became Speaker of the House of Commons, one of the most senior positions in the British Constitution, held by a man who had personally signed a secret protocol to falsify the public justification for a war. George Humphrey faced no inquiry of any kind. He left the Treasury on his own timetable in mid-1957, returned to his steel business in Cleveland, and was later credited by American economic historians with having engineered, calmly and without authorization from any statute written for the purpose, one of the most consequential uses of financial leverage in the 20th century. He was praised for it. Dwight Eisenhower won re-election in a landslide 3 days after the invasion began, carrying it as a demonstration that the United States, not the old colonial powers, now set the terms in the Middle East. Nobody who executed the financial pressure on Britain paid any price for it at all. Eden paid a price, but he paid it for the invasion the cabinet had voted for, not for the fact that Washington, and not Cairo, was the government that actually decided when it would end. Widen the frame, and the pattern is not really about Eden, or Humphrey, or even about Suez specifically. It is about what a reserve currency actually is. Sterling's status as a currency the world held and trusted had been Britain's single greatest instrument of power for a century. It was what let a country the size of a large American state finance a navy that ruled every ocean and administer territory across a quarter of the globe. But a currency other countries hold is also a currency other countries can stop holding, and by 1956, the country capable of making that threat credible at scale, in a matter of weeks, was no longer Britain, it was Washington. The mechanism that ended the Suez operation, not tanks, not the United Nations, not even Nasser's own resistance, all of which mattered less than the reserve figures, was the same mechanism that had quietly replaced the pound with the dollar as the world's dominant reserve currency over the preceding decade, and would go on completing that replacement over the decade that followed. Sterling still accounted for close to half of global currency reserves in the mid-1950s. Within 10 years, the dollar held roughly twice sterling's share, and in November 1967, 11 years almost to the month after Suez, Britain devalued the pound outright by 14%, a step Macmillan and Cobbold had spent the whole of that earlier November trying desperately to avoid. The country never fully recovered sterling's position as a reserve currency again. The structure that decided the outcome at Suez did not end in 1957. 15 years later, in August 1971, the United States itself broke the other half of the Bretton Woods arrangement, suspending the dollar's convertibility into gold and ending the system Britain's own 1956 crisis had been fought inside. A reminder that the country holding the reserve currency sets the rules for everyone, including, eventually, itself. In 1976, it is the same structure, in a narrower and more formalized form, that determined the terms of Britain's loan from the IMF, when a Labour government facing its own sterling crisis had to accept public spending cuts, effectively dictated from Washington, as a condition of the money. A negotiation historians of that later crisis describe, explicitly, as Suez playing out a second time with the details changed. It is a version of the same structure that moved against the pound and against UK government bonds during the market reaction to the September 2022 mini-budget, when a government's fiscal plan was unwound within days, not by a parliamentary vote, but by the bond market's verdict on it. A British chancellor forced out of a job by a spreadsheet again, 66 years after the first one. The particular actors change. The mechanism that the country issuing the world's most trusted currency holds a form of leverage over every other country that depends on that currency. Leverage that requires no army, no treaty, and answers to no electorate but its own, has not changed at all since a Treasury Secretary in Washington picked up a telephone in the autumn of 1956 and decided, quietly, that an empire's last independent military operation would end exactly when its dollars ran out. Britain did not lose its financial empire in a courtroom, or at a peace conference, or in a vote at the United Nations. It lost it over 6 weeks in the autumn of 1956, in a set of reserve figures nobody outside a small circle in London and Washington was allowed to see in real time, decided by a man who never had to explain himself in public, and who kept his job, his reputation, and his freedom entirely intact. The soldiers who took Port Said in a single day were not defeated by Egypt. They were recalled by a spreadsheet. That is not a metaphor. It is the specific, documented mechanism by which the 20th century's most significant transfer of global financial power actually happened. And the institution that inherited it has never once been asked, in the 70 years since, to answer for how it used that power, only asked, periodically, to use it again. You made it to the end of a story most people only know as a canal dispute. What you actually have now is something more specific, a working model for reading every currency crisis that has happened since, because the mechanism at the center of it, a reserve currency as a form of leverage that operates without votes, without armies, and almost entirely without scrutiny, is still the mechanism running underneath the headlines about government bond markets today. If that is the kind of history you came here for, drop the word reserve in the comments, because that is the word this entire video was actually about. This channel exists to trace the financial architecture sitting underneath the events everyone already thinks they understand, and building each of these takes a genuinely large amount of archival research. So if it was worth your time, subscribing is what allows the next one to get made. Until then,